Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Reimagining Religious Freedom, moving from education to advocacy. I am Dr. Sabrina Dent, curator of the Religious Freedom Mobile Institute. Before we move forward with tonight's program, it's only appropriate that we acknowledge that this is Native American Heritage Month. And I come to you from the Native Acostan lands right outside of our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. I also sit here acknowledging the spirits of formerly enslaved Africans, many who suffered on plantations, including those that had to be invisible or silent in the spaces while plans of religious freedom, citizenship, and voting rights were debated by America's founding framers that did not prioritize their humanity. And on this Veterans Day, I acknowledge the many individuals who have sacrificed through their service and to our country, including my great-grandfather, my father, my uncle, my brother-in-law, and many cousins and beloved friends. Thank you. Thank you all to our veterans for your service and to your families for the sacrifices that they've made. May we all continue to stay committed to addressing the issues that impact our communities and those who have served and those who are often silent and too often underappreciated. Our work is not done until the freedoms for which they have fought are extended to all of humanity. So again, I want to say welcome and thank you for joining us. So before we go further, I want to just provide a few housekeeping rules for everyone that has joined us this evening. And we're so gracious that you've taken time of your schedule to be with us. We want to remind you that this session is being recorded for future use. And we will put that up on our YouTube channel to make that available at a later date. But this is a webinar, so you can see the presenters, but you can't see the other participants or attendees. At the same time, it's important to note that you can use the chat feature to communicate or share thoughts. If you have an aha moment, please feel free to share it in the chat. If you want to say hello, that's fine too. At the same time, we offer the Q&A option. So if you hear something and you have a question and you want to know more, please put that in the Q&A. We have our friends that are monitoring the chat and the Q&A for us this evening. So I just want to remind you that this virtual conference, Reimagining Religious Freedom, is hosted in partnership with Vanderbilt Divinity School's Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, or known as the BJC, the Center for Public Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary, KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. Thank you to all of our partners for your support in making this evening possible, this event possible, actually, along with the generous support of the Henry Luce Foundation. This event and this moment is a dream come true. I would also like to thank our friends at Union Presbyterian Seminary and Mike Monteiro, who is in the background managing things behind the scenes for us, along with our volunteer support team members, Ms. Sophie Hersher with Grandview Strategies, who designed the beautiful social graphics that you saw on social media and in the emails that you received. And also our friend, Ms. Victoria Hamilton, who is managing the chat with us this evening. We couldn't do this without any of your support. So again, I want to say thank you. We also want to thank our presenters and the speakers that you will hear over the next few days for the wisdom and their investment of time and the insights that they will bring to these critical conversations. But I must acknowledge that none of this would be possible but for one woman. With that, I am elated to be joined by my sister, my thought partner, my friend, Vanderbilt Divinity School postdoctoral fellow and associate director for the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative, Dr. Teresa Smallwood. She is our speaker for tonight's opening session, and so I want to properly introduce her to all of you. Reverend Dr. Teresa L. Smallwood, Esquire, is the postdoctoral fellow and associate director for Vanderbilt Divinity School's Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. She was born in Windsor, North Carolina, and she is the daughter of the late Harry and late Maddie Cherry Smallwood. Dr. Smallwood graduated from Bertie Senior High School with honors in 1978. She attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for undergraduate studies, where she majored in speech communications and Afro-American studies and graduated with a BA degree. She received her Juris Doctorate degree in 1985 from North Carolina Central University School of Law. Dr. Smallwood began her legal career with Legal Services of Southern Piedmont in Charlotte, North Carolina. She also worked there as the staff attorney for the Children's Law Center in the same city. In 1989, she served as the assistant district attorney until she commenced her private practice that spanned more than 2 decades or 20 years. Dr. Smallwood is a published author, scholar, womanist theologian, and a social justice advocate. Her commitment to social justice embodies the intersectional approach that marries the law, theological education, and her lived experience. In 2019, she joined the teaching team for the Religious Freedom Center's project, Religious Freedom, African American Perspectives, with the Freedom Forum. In January of 2021, the Freedom Forum published the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities. You can see it in the background here, of which she was a contributing author. Dr. Smallwood is currently working on a book under review for publication titled The Bully Pulpit, Queer and Black in Church. She has presented numerous papers and lectures and served as a panelist at Morgan State University, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, Vanderbilt University, the Children's Defense Fund, as well as Chicago Theological Seminary, Oxford University, and many others. In July of 2021, she joined the faculty at United Lutheran Seminary, where she serves as the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Esther Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology. Dr. Smallwood currently resides in Nashville, Tennessee, having graduated with a Ph.D. in May of 2017 from Chicago Theological Seminary in the areas of theology, ethics, and human sciences. Her dissertation was entitled The Leprosy Effect, a Queer Womanist Pastoral Care Model. She was licensed and ordained to public ministry while serving Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church in Lewiston, North Carolina. She is a member at New Covenant Christian Church in Nashville under the pastoral leadership of Reverend Dr. Judy Cummins. With that, I introduce to some and present to others Dr. Teresa Smallwood.
Good evening. It is certainly my honor to be with you this evening. And while I do not count it a real joy to have to speak because I have to come before Sabrina Dent, I do certainly count it a joy to work with her. And this has been a labor of love for me. What she asked me to do tonight is to sort of situate my work here at Vanderbilt in this present moment in which we live here in America. All people of color, all BIPOC people are experiencing an uptick in racial injustice. And my work so providentially drove me to a place of understanding the more systemic and structured ways in which that very experience of the uptick of violence comes about. And I have every reason to thank the dean and awesome woman, Reverend Dr. Emily M. Towns, for the vision that brought forth my work. Now, Sabrina Dent has already paid homage, you could say, to the Henry Luce Foundation, but the work that I do is completely supported by the Henry Luce Foundation. And what they have done is to give us really the creative freedom to think about what it means for a public-facing witness of our faith to speak truth to power and also to speak truth in power around issues of racial injustice in the world. And so it is certainly, for me, fitting to give you an idea of how things started here. At Vanderbilt, this was a $1 million grant. And it started with me as postdoctoral fellow and associate director of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. But what it caused me to do as a postdoctoral fellow is to think deeply and critically about how race and injustice work in our world. And so what I'd like to do is to share with you my screen, and hopefully in doing so, this video will play, and thereafter we'll talk a little bit about what my work has been. A theology that seeks to understand will open itself to everyone else's effort to understand.
The collaborative wants to change the world. That's what any good person of faith or religious belief is put here to do, that what we have is not the best that there can be.
The Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative is a think tank, essentially. It is born from the vision of a visionary woman. The dean of the Vanderbilt Divinity School, I believe, is on the cutting edge of what we need to do in terms of how the ivory tower meets the street.
The Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative is designed to be a hub for both strategy making and information sharing, and not trying to create a new organization, but to serve as a conduit for activists and folks who may not even be activists to figure out how to live into racial justice and advocate for racial justice in light of their faith and their beliefs.
This year's Summer Institute, June 4th through 8th, is going to focus on 2 tracks. The first track is entitled Social Trauma, Social Death. The second track is about truth-telling and self-care from the front lines. The focus is to bring balance, is to look at the issues that we are confronted with each day, but it's also to learn from the stories.
One of the things that we'll be offering for all of the participants is media training. How do you get your message across in language that folks can understand, with your commitments still intact, and able to be somewhat able to shape or at least provoke further thought. We have been careful in having an end goal, which is to look at the midterm elections this coming fall and saying to folks, all right, what's going on in your place? And how can you, as a representative of a religious community of some sort, make a difference in bringing in candidates or legislation or whatever's at stake that really does enhance the flourishing of more than just a few.
We want to attract activists, folk who are on the front lines, doing the work. I want to have people who are
leaders in their churches, but we also want to attract young people. Young people give me hope. They have inspired me to know that our future is bright. So bright, in fact, you gotta wear shades.
Putting all that together, I have to believe, and I do believe, that what will happen is that we will come up with tangible things that folks can take back to where they're working in their day-to-day lives and really begin to shape the world in a different way.
I'm very confident that the foundation supporting this effort seeks to seed a vision around a better America, one in which our differences is not something that would cause us to be divided, but would actually be something that we can count up as a true value.
Now is the time for us to live what we say we believe.
A theology that seeks.
So my work at the Vanderbilt Divinity School helped me to engage with the Freedom Forum. And it was there that I began to dive deeply into this issue of religious freedom. As you can obviously know, there's been an uptick in our nation around violence, and much of it is driven by religious beliefs. I am very happy to be in conversation with the BJC, because the BJC helped us to focus in on the fact that religious freedom in and of itself has been white too long. And so I have this image here of Whipped Peter, AKA Gordon, who was considered an enslaved African, but who, as you can see, ran away often. So much so until his back is plastered with all kinds of risings that come about as a result of his skin keloiding. And what this picture has done for me as I've begun to think critically around religious freedom is to understand that African Americans have not always understood or experienced the freedom to live into their faith the way others have. But Whipped Peter's back sings a song to me. And that song says, before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. And so what we understand about religious freedom is that we need to be advocates, not only for the Whipped Peters in the world, AKA Gordon, but for all of God's children. Because the lies that have been told about people who are not white, that some are lunatics, that others are beasts, that we are lazy, that we have over-sexuality, over-sexualized. All of those lies are still being promoted and promulgated. And what I've seen in this uptick of violence is also an uptick of a very conservative wave of America trying to take us back to a place that we have long abandoned. That place of what many would call enslavement, and what I today would identify as the powers that be trying to literally take away our freedom to be. You've seen constraints like this on movies, but what it really is a personalized jail. And in order to break from these metal bars, the human jail, our folk have had to march. We've had to resist. We've had to demonstrate in the streets, because religious freedom says to us that our liberty is not tied to the structures that will keep us down, but our liberty is tied to the justice of God. And so when we think about reimagining religious freedom, we're talking about killing Jim Crow he cannot come back. He will not have a resurrection. We're talking about the capacity for us to remember that while they still want to call us brutes, while they still want to associate us with bestiality, we're not brutes. We're men, we're women. And despite the many bayonets and the many other ways in which tanks roll up and down our streets, that we can and will seek justice. I've come to understand that because craniology in the 17th century was deployed as a weapon against us, that this idea of us being animal-like stuck. And you see in this one image, two little children carrying a sign that say, we're not animals, we need jobs. This is the work of public theology and racial justice, to draw attention to the struggle and to draw attention to the resiliency of a people whose faith will not keep them down, to the resiliency of people who understand their own plight and who understand that though the guns have been drawn against us, we will not take down. So I'm thinking today about Frederick Douglass. I'm thinking about what he wrote as he talked about in his own reflections, how religionists were the worst enslavers. And I'm saying to you, there is a reason why you're seeing people offer legislation claiming that it is to ban critical race theory, when in fact, critical race theory is a topic that is out of legal theory, has absolutely nothing to do with our history. What you really realize is that the work of our public faith and witness is to help people know that they will never erase our history. They will never erase our story, that we will continue to tell our story and to be what Frederick Douglass suggests, people of our own destinies. For he has said to us, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And what he most definitely left with us as a legacy is that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And so if we have to fight the fight all over again, that Fannie Lou Hamer fought, to be sure that our voting rights are put in place, that John Lewis's name will be a part of a legacy of legislation, that is the work of our public face and witness. That is the work of racial justice. Because it's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. And I'm reminded every 4th of July that it means nothing without freedom. So when Douglass says, you have seen how a man was made a slave, I want us to, with our womanist sensibility, say, now let me show you how enslaved ancestors have shown us the way to a freedom that makes us men and women, so that we can see without question the importance of how progress towards freedom helps us deal with the agitation, helps us deal with the years, so that just like Rabbi Abraham Heschel said to us when he marched with Dr. King, he felt as though his legs were praying. And it gives us the ability to think about our ancestors like Denmark Vesey and others who understood their role, who even through insurrection came to grips with the fact, just like Nat Turner, that we must fight And even though they take us down, we've got the freedom to be what God has intended for us to be. Thank you. And now it is my esteemed honor to introduce to you the keynote speaker for this evening. And before I do so, let me say that I too am acknowledging being here in Nashville, Tennessee, that I'm seated on the tribal lands of the Muskogee or Creek, the Yuki, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, and the Seneca. And I'm proud to be a witness. I also want to acknowledge that as we move into our best selves, and as we think about the importance of our own experiences, our lived experiences, it requires of us to have a true commitment, a true and undying commitment to the things of our faith and to the things of our freedoms that have already been written. So without further ado, let me introduce Sabrina E. Dent, Doctor of Ministry. She's a lifelong advocate for human rights and social justice. As an interfaith leader, Dr. Dent developed a strong passion for religious freedom as a 2015 BJC Fellow with the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Her public scholarship addresses religious freedom issues that impact African Americans and marginalized communities in ways that undermine their civil rights and social needs. Previously, Dr. Dent served as the Senior Faith Advisor for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. As a member of the Faith for Equality Working Group, she mobilized religious leaders to amplify faith voices on legislative issues such as the Equality Act to ensure and expand federal legal protections for LGBTQ+ individuals, people of color, women, and religious minority groups. In March of 2021, Dr. Dent led the charge in organizing in the Washington interfaith staff communities, the Interfaith Rally and March, a call for justice and healing, calling on elected officials to address police reform and public policies that target historically marginalized communities. Dr. Dent has presented at numerous programs and events, including Melissa Rogers' Faith in American Public Life book launch on C-SPAN Book TV. Her writings have been published by the Religion News Service, Freedom Forum, Christian Citizen, and Americans United. In 2020, she was nominated for the American Academy of Religion's Martin E. Marty Award for the public understanding of religion. In April of 2021, Dr. Dent's faith outreach and advocacy efforts were recognized by the Center for American Progress when she was named one of the 21 faith leaders to watch in 2021. On Monday afternoons at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, twice a month, you can find Dr. Dent on Facebook as a co-host for the Sister Act podcast with Honoressa Fariad and Rabbi Sue Shankman. The podcast is dedicated to women of faith from different religious traditions, discussing life, faith, and resilience on various topics. Sabrina, as I've come to know and love her, is most proud of her work on the 3-year project with the Freedom Forum funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, titled Religious Freedom, African American Perspectives. And this program, in partnership with the 6 historically Black theological institutions, explored the complex politics of race and religion in America via the multidisciplinary approach of theological, museum, and First Amendment education. She is the editor and contributor of the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities. Sabrina earned her Master of Divinity degree and Doctor of Ministry degree from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. Her doctoral project title was Bridging the Gap of Race and Interfaith Relations, Connecting Humanity with Our Stories. She earned her bachelor's degree from Virginia Tech. Sabrina is a native of Petersburg, Virginia, and a proud mother. I give you Dr. Sabrina Dent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smallwood. I appreciate you, and I'm so grateful. I actually, when you were speaking, I was thinking that maybe we should end afterwards because you gave such a powerful presentation about the incredible and transformative work that is taking place at Vanderbilt Divinity School through the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative. So I have endless gratitude for you and respect for you, for your being and for your justice and for who you are in every aspect of a person of faith and in ministry. And so I'm so grateful for you. To all that have joined us tonight, again, good evening and thank you. So I have some slides that I want to share, and I want to share an image as we reflect on tonight's conversation and how we'll enter into this thinking about awaken to a new reality of religious freedom. And so if you give me a moment, I will share my slides. So I skipped ahead there, but we're just gonna go right back. So, as I said, today's talk is called Awaken to a New Reality of Religious Freedom. Our lives depend on it. And so as I prepared for tonight's event, my mind could not stop thinking about the imagery and the news stories that filled my social media timeline. And I will show you one of them that you might be familiar with here. I'm gonna skip through that and I will come back to sharing this. This image here, this is one that we've all seen. We saw this in the public square happening here in our nation's capital on January 6th. It was the insurrection that took place at the US Capitol building. And when I see this image, I often think and raise the question, how did this have impact on people of color, religious minorities, non-religious individuals? What about immigrants? Like, what about those that are seeking to come to the United States to escape the atrocities of where they might be from? I also thought about the imagery that has filled my social media timeline in the most recent days. That is the awareness of the lived experiences of Black and Brown people in this country at the expense of what some might call white rage or white fragility. I struggled, and I'll stop sharing this image, but I want you to think about this image as we talk tonight. I struggled with watching the clips of Kyle Rittenhouse's trial because of a deep emotion that stirred memories of the tragic loss of life in the name of self-defense and false convictions. It is a story that Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, Emmett Till, and others like George Junius Stinney Jr. faced. He was a 14-year-old Black boy who was falsely convicted of murdering 2 white girls in South Carolina. He was executed in 1944 as the youngest person in the United States to be executed. But he was exonerated in 2015 for having an unfair trial 70 years later. Or to bring it to this present moment of time, as Julius Jones in Oklahoma faces a pending execution date 1 week from today, although the parole board has evidence of his innocence. When I think about these images that I've seen, and I think about history of a people, of peoples, of nations, indigenous nations, we have to talk about the realities of our country. So it is written with these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and I'm gonna add women, are created equal, but they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These are very powerful words that were written in the Declaration of Independence. They exhort ideas that often go unrealized for many African Americans and people of color in the United States. Whereas many Americans embrace the practices of religious freedom and celebrate diversity, too often racial and religious minority groups continue to be negatively impacted by social perceptions and public policies, which are constructed as an assault on their identities. Paramount to what is perceived to be a post-racial and pluralistic society, African Americans of all religious identities and none continue to struggle with the realities and historical implications of racial, social, and economic disparities, which are systematically symptomatic of America's flawed foundation. Former presidential candidate Shirley Chisholm once said, "Racism is so universal in this country, so widespread and deep-seated, that it is invisible because it is so normal." Racism has been normalized in the last 20 years in ways that religion has been weaponized to discriminate against racial and religious minority communities. If 2020 wasn't enough for COVID-19 revealing the racial disparities and inequities experienced by communities of color and the working poor in healthcare, education, transportation, and even the ability to earn a livable wage, 2021 has proven to be a year where we all must awaken to a new reality of religious freedom. The events that occurred on January 6th showed and revealed America's worst and, unfortunately, its legacy as a country. Many people said, "This is not the America that I know." Ask a person of color. Ask a religious minority. You might get a different answer. On September the 17th, 1791, 41 of the 55 state delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention to conclude the process of writing the initial blueprint for America's system of governing. They represented different generations and backgrounds, and in their minds, different countries. See, each state was seen as its own independent country. And this, unfortunately, can still be observed today when you look at the inconsistency of public policies and laws that protect some and not others, and then sometimes criminalize others. To that, those states, they pledged their allegiance, and they boldly took issue with the idea of being united. Some of them were wealthy, and others of them came from humble beginnings. But all of them were white men who secretly discussed agendas and ideas that would shape a divided nation. The three main issues that were addressed during this convening were how the president would be elected, the Electoral College, which impacts voting rights and voting issues, the slave trade, which is about human freedom, the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, including the freedom of religion. These were all controversial issues that led to very heated debates by elected state representatives who would become the founding framers. This moment in American history gave birth to the United States Constitution that will become the written supreme law of the land. The Constitution outlined how and who would govern the country. It set a foundation and structure for America's malignant way of functioning. As a consequence, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness will continue to be a never-ending aspiration for African Americans and people of color in America. Through a historical lens of inquiry, I raised these questions. How is freedom understood by a group of white, mostly slave-owning men whose intentions were to establish a new constitution and a new society by protecting their own interests and property? Is it really possible for freedom and liberation to be fully extended to all when the country's exception was started with exclusion? This is not just a question of establishment, but one of morality and justice. There's a book that's written by Thomas McCullough called The Moral Imagination of Public Life, Raising the Ethical Question. And he presented an argument that challenged the ethics of public policy by raising questions about value systems that are sometimes implemented by politicians, leaders, economists, and individuals that impact how communities are often mishandled. McCullough asserted that textbook ethics are seldom practiced in boiler room situations and posed questions about making tough decisions that may affect one's personal integrity. Specifically raising this point, in each situation, how does a person arrive at an intelligent, principled decision with personal integrity? This is where an understanding of morality is important. Morality is understood as a way of life. It involves individual and communal aspects. McCullough suggests that it takes into account embedded practices, beliefs, attitudes, and ways of being in the world. It is beyond a responsibility to oneself, but a community, a larger set of ideas that benefit the greater good of all humanity. And so for the sake of this conversation, when I'm saying community, I'm talking about those who hold us in care and accountable for our actions. So this is why we're convening this evening as a community of activists, scholars, religious and non-religious people who are committed to awakening to a new reality of religious freedom in America, because all of our lives depend on it. As noted in a book about the Constitution by Sarah Levinson, in their book, they wrote that the framers all had different interpretations of justice. We still see that today, where there are different interpretations and understandings around justice. What is justice? To disrupt the narrative about religious freedom in this country, then mandates that we highlight and interrogate the actions of the fragmented founders who willingly use their power and influence. Let's think about this for a moment. What would our country look like today if the 55 delegates and the 54 who considered the words of Governor Morris denounced the slave trade in 1787? What would our country be today if women, racial and religious minorities were active participants at the Philadelphia Convention? I'm not certain of all the details that would have happened, but I would guess that we would probably be in a better place. Awakening to a new reality requires us to examine things that are in our founding documents, such as Article 6 of the US Constitution that clearly outlines that there is no religious test for office and that candidates are only bound to uphold the Constitution. Yet we find that in the court of public opinion, there continues to be this moral dilemma about who has the right to be in America and how one should believe. We see this often around times of elections. But it's important to note that even elections and voting rights are issues that are central to religious freedom concerns. So in 2020, Virginia became the first Southern state to enact a comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, but also they included a piece of legislation, the Virginia Values Act, which extends legal protections of all crucial areas of life for people that might identify as LGBTQ. Now, this is a great victory, especially when you see how far Virginia has come in its history of discriminatory practices against people of color as it pertains to many issues like marriage equality, housing, voting rights, and religious discrimination. I want to pause right there and share a story with you. My uncle, Gary Dent, earlier this year, we had a conversation in talking about voting rights. And he shared with me that my grandfather, who lived in Chesapeake, Virginia, went to vote in 1966. And when he went to vote at the polls, he was then given a polling test. The person working the polls said to my grandfather that in order for him to vote, he had to count the number of jelly beans that were in the jar, or guess the number of jelly beans in the jar. Now, it's important to share with you that my grandfather, following the rule of law in the state of Virginia at the time, had already paid the polling tax to vote, but then he faced another barrier as he went to the polls to exercise his right in this democracy. So it impacts voting rights, but it also impacts us in areas of, like I said, housing, marriage equality, and even racial discrimination. So just to give you a little bit more history about the state of Virginia, on June 12, 1967, the Supreme Court decided the landmark case, Loving versus Virginia, unanimously ruling that banning interracial marriage was illegal. Richard Loving, a white man, and his Black and Native American wife, Mildred Loving, only desired to live their lives peacefully together and raise their children in Caroline County, Virginia. However, their love and union was considered a violation of the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. The act was birthed by white supremacist Walter Plecker, who was a devout Presbyterian, son of a Confederate soldier, and a medical professional who instituted the one-drop rule. Plecker proclaimed that damaging religious beliefs that suggested that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah due to race mixing that occurred. In essence, he upheld white supremacist ideologies that were shaped by pseudoscientific practices of eugenics and his religious beliefs that denied the human dignity of Black and Indigenous people in the United States. The deep implications of Plecker's personal and religious practices manifested in racist ways that impacted his service, get this, as the first registrar of vital statistics at the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics. Plecker would be the first person to assign racial identity of a person on a birth certificate from 1912 to 1946. He used his religious beliefs and his ideologies about race to determine how one identifies in the world. In 2021, some may assume that this mix of discrimination and religion is a thing of the past, but many are still harmed by this toxic fusion. The white supremacist practices and ideologies that have propagated whites as a superior race for centuries continue to have grave implications in 2020 in the form of racial bigotry, gender bias, LGBTQ discrimination, and religious privilege. Specifically, Christian privilege in the United States. A subset of Christian religious leaders with narrow-minded worldviews need to take into account the many historical ways that religion was used to disenfranchise and extort Indigenous and Black communities for their own gain. Black people have consistently had to fight for the rights to be fully recognized in society, even with the penning of the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Voting Rights Act. The experience of the Lovins and every racial and religious minority in the United States should serve as a reminder of what happens when racist ideologies and religious supremacy of any kind determine the fate of any group of people. Discrimination promoted under the guise of religious freedom is no exception. It is immoral, unethical, and unacceptable. To reimagine the promises of the Constitution, we must remember that every person has the right to freedom of religion, that is to practice their religious beliefs or to not profess any, according to their own conscience. Religion and religious freedom should never be used as a weapon to cause harm to others or to discriminate. However, in 2020, we continue to see proposed pieces of legislation that undermine voting rights in states by closing houses of worship that have historically served as polling places that serve the surrounding communities. At the same time, we've witnessed where some religious leaders have pushed back on vaccine mandates that prioritize public health and safety by citing their religious beliefs. The separation of religion and government, as outlined in the First Amendment and of the Constitution in these words, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people to peacefully assemble to petition the government for the redress of grievances. It's important that we remember that the government should not show favoritism or preference towards any religious group, and that people of all religions and none must be treated fairly. This is what the highest law in the land reminds us. There is no place for Christian nationalism in a country that was never founded on Christian principles, and never should be one's identity as an American be tied as such. So in essence, what it means to be American doesn't mean that you have to be Christian or vice versa. That everyone has the right to practice their beliefs according to their own conscience. So in 2021, I strongly believe that faith communities have a responsibility to continue holding our elected officials accountable to their moral obligation to serve we the people. We the people of the United States in 2021 is comprised of religious and non-religious people from beautiful and diverse racial and cultural and ethnic backgrounds who identify by many gender identities and pronouns. Some of our families were brought to America in chains. Other families arrived by choice. And even some out of desperation for a better life seeking asylum here in our country. We've seen that recently with the Afghan refugees, as well as the Haitian refugees who are seeking safety in this country. We in the United States are over 165.9 million women strong, with voting rights guaranteed by the 19th Amendment. Unlike 1787, we are in the Supreme Court, the Senate, the Congress, and even in the White House with our first elected Black and Asian woman of descent, VP Kamala Harris. We have the right to make choices about healthcare, about our bodies, about reproductive rights, about policies and laws that impact our being. So you might ask, why does all this matter? Well, it matters because to be a leader, a faith leader in the 21st century, does not require that you are perfect, but willing to take risks to ensure the freedom and human dignity of every person. This is how we address the moral imperative of freedom in this country. We cannot unsee the cries for humanity around the world in the wake of the tragic deaths of so many people of color, including our trans brothers and sisters like Dominique Remy Fales, a Black trans woman who was murdered last year, and many more to name throughout the public proclamations that Black Lives Matter. With this inclusive approach, the vested stakeholders must pledge a commitment to addressing systemic change in policies and political systems. That's on a local level, a state level, regionally, and nationally. And for those that might be watching, even globally. So friends, this lecture, it served as an invitation for all of us to interrogate the ways in which religion and religious freedom have been weaponized across time, laws, disciplines, and public policies. The examples that I shared invite us to reimagine conversations about innocent children who are victims of racially motivated terrorism that impacts their liberation, existence, survival, and religious identities, who are separated from their families in courtrooms, and sometimes even, as we've seen, at the borders. If we believe that religious freedom is a constitutional and human right for people of all religions and none, then we must awaken to a new reality and take the necessary action steps to address an administration who made promises of prioritizing religious freedom, by which they did end the ban against Muslim majority countries and African nations. But we must help them to see how religion continues to be used to disenfranchise public education by supporting private school voucher programs that do not support the greater good of all of our children, no matter how they show up in life. We must be proactive about petitioning our elected leaders about issues that matter to us. If we believe that religious freedom is a constitutional and human right for all, then we must make every effort to educate ourselves about the issues, engage in dialogue with one another, and seek understanding about our perspectives, our experiences, and take action. You will have the opportunity this week to hear from many speakers that come from many different perspectives. We have people that work in environmental justice, such as Kendall Crawley-Crawford, who is with Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, working on environmental justice issues and water justice. We have people like Dr. Takesha Dwan Everett, who is with Health Equity Solutions, addressing healthcare disparities that impact so many communities of color, especially our children. We'll also be joined by elected officials, such as Representative Padma Kupa, who is the first Indian immigrant and Hindu American to serve in the Michigan State Legislature, who has prioritized education as part of her priorities and platform for this year. There are so many voices that you will hear from. There are so many scholars and religious leaders that are on the ground that are taking action in many different ways. But you also will have the opportunity on Saturday to participate in an advocacy training hosted by our friends at the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the BJC. They'll tell us more about the work that they're doing in saving the sacred native lands of Indigenous communities through the campaign Save Oak Flat. Overall, friends, it is the responsibility of religious leaders and free thinkers of a moral conscience to be intentional about our efforts to include all voices in this discussion about religious freedom. We must be compassionate listeners who are willing to take risks to advocate for those who are challenged by privilege and sit on the margins of life. And we must collaborate with others who are already doing this work. In closing, I want to share one story with you about why it's important for faith communities to engage in advocacy work. Earlier this year, I participated in a National Day of Action that was hosted by Americans United, where we participated in virtual lobby visits with our congressional representatives and senators' offices to discuss an important piece of legislation, specifically the Do No Harm Act. For those that aren't familiar with it, the Do No Harm Act was introduced in the US Senate this year on September the 15th by Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. The Do No Harm Act is a piece of legislation that clarifies that religious freedom should never be used to inflict harm on other people. Although the Religious Freedom Restoration Act has been used many times by religious groups to bypass federal protections designed to protect the most vulnerable populations, including children and child labor and abuse, as well as equal employment and non-discrimination, as well as healthcare and federal contracts and grants and many other government services. The Do No Harm Act ensures that religious freedom is used as a shield to protect the constitutional right to free exercise of religion and not a sword to discriminate. So to get back to my story, toward the end of the visit with the elected official, we made the ask of the aide to which to support this piece of legislation, to which the response was, if the bill was already on the floor, they would have already voted in support of it. For me, moral leadership in this country requires that proactive leadership that embodies care and compassion for all. Centuries of poor decisions in the best interests of the 1% have left blood on the many hands and streets of people in communities of color and in impoverished communities. So I challenge you. I'm challenging myself. Over the next 2 days, I want all of us to think about the critical role that we play in disrupting narratives about religious freedom that have not served all Americans or people well. We need to reimagine the role of religion and how we engage in our communities, in the public square, and in shaping public policies that prioritize the fullness of our humanity in areas of environmental justice, healthcare, reproductive freedom, and voting rights. Friends, this work requires all of us to take action. So, in the words of Ida B. Wells, I end with this reminder. The only way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them. I invite you to be an active participant over the next couple of days of this Reimagining Religious Freedom Conference. I invite you to take good notes and have a healthy sense of curiosity. And we will do this work together. And so shall it be. Thank you. So friends, with that, I want to say thank you for being with us this evening, and we will open it up for Q&A. Dr. Teresa, if you want to join me on screen. I see that there have been some questions that have been floating in the chat from the beginning when you gave your presentation until now. And so I want to thank everyone that has joined us. And so we'll look and see what questions we have. And I see Victoria has helped us in putting some of the questions out there for us to respond to. So one of the questions that I see, Dr. Smallwood, this was directed to you. How can we transform our current church theology from one of personal piety to one of transformative justice.
So, in my experience, I'm getting a feedback. Are you hearing that?
No, but I'll mute myself while you respond.
Okay. In my experience, theological education helps that. It helps us have a deeper understanding of exactly what biblical literalism, biblical legalism has done. And quite frankly, we have to examine what psychologists call the belief systems of our churches. Quite frankly, there are a lot of churches continuously putting forth the message of the oppressor. And when that happens, of course, people get an embedded understanding that keeps them in shackles, what Naim Akbar called the slavery of the mind. And so one of the things that I advance often is that we want to make sure people have had exposure to critical thinking. And that comes through theological education, but it can come through other things too. One of the things I instituted at my own churches over the years is to have book readings. And it would not be wrong at all to think about getting that African Americans and Religious Freedom text and reading that with your congregation. Because in it, the contributions really cover the gambit of why our language, our narrative has to change, and it has to line up with the justice that the Bible actually speaks about. That's one big thing for me. And then we also need to not be so hostile to folk in our pews who have advanced education. It seems to be, for me, a lot of pushback when someone shows up who has gone to school and could probably help to sort through some of the bad theology we've been hanging on to for so long.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smallwood. So to that, there is a follow-up question that someone shared about what is the role of seminaries to push for issues of economic and environmental justice?
Oh, the role is heavy. It should be. Not all of them are being willing to carry the water, so to speak. But I am, I cannot speak her praises enough. Emily Towns is a visionary, and she's not at a seminary. She's at a university, divinity school, that oftentimes you'll find connects itself a whole lot more deeply and will not allow certain things to happen. But even in this university, we are pressing forward with the notion that it's our responsibility to draw attention. It's our responsibility to be praxeological in our efforts. You can't just study theory if it has no application. So praxeology gives us not only the practice, but the theory, and they marry themselves together well. And that's why then that we are engaged in community involvement. We have, through our efforts, seen a new community garden come about. And through our efforts, we brought attention to medical apartheid. That medical apartheid helped us identify, through Harriet Washington's work, how the water systems, when you talk about ecological and environmental, how the water systems have been deliberately tainted. And so because people don't know, they drink the water. So we have to build upon our theological interdisciplinary approaches. And part of that is to engage science, is to engage reason, is to engage philosophy in the context of how we form ourselves, and not only form, but transform ourselves to a renewed mind. This is why when we think in terms of what's going on, the attacks that are going on voter rights, voter suppression, issues around education and who can teach what, the erasure that seems to be trying to be happening around critical race theory being a catch-all for anything having to do with our sordid past, if you don't know the history, if you don't know what's happening with that, if you have no clue, then it will be lost on you that Prince Edward County in Virginia shut down public schools when Brown versus Board came about. And you won't even be aware of the fact that from 1959 to 1964, they got out of the business of education. And this is where they're driving this. And so in essence, then, it becomes very important for us to take what we have in the academy and that so-called ivory tower. And we need to come out of the tower and be in the streets. And when we talk about what's going on in the environment, we need to also hand people some options, which is to say we can do exactly what we're doing when we talk about building wells in Africa. We can build some things right here. And we need to be in position to give our folk good food to eat and to make sure we take all of the steps we have to shut down those places of food insecurity and be sure that when the environment has been tainted, that it gets cleaned up, because that should be the work of government. And we need to know what our rights are and operate in them.
Yes, Dr. Teresa, yes. And so you said so much there that is so important about like our lives, our livelihoods, our children, our communities being able to thrive and live. And so I know, and immediately what I thought of when you talked about food insecurity, I know that the previous Mobile Institute that you hosted was about food insecurity and working with leaders, faith leaders who are taking action on this issue. And also it makes me immediately think about the work of Dr. Lafayette Jefferson in my hometown of Petersburg, Virginia, who earned his DMin like I did from Virginia Union University, but he's also the president of the NAACP, and they have prioritized addressing issues around food insecurity because Petersburg has been identified as a food desert. And so when you're talking about these issues, like we're not just talking about them in a vacuum, right? It's like, these are things that impact our communities and our families. And so to that, I see that we have the question, when those in the public square want to participate in this movement, what are the top 5 priorities? So I say to that, think about what's happening in your community. What are the things that are important? What are the things that you see? Is it around housing insecurity? Is it around food insecurity? Is it about access to healthcare? Adequate healthcare, affordable healthcare. People should not have to choose between living and taking medicine because they cannot afford it, right? So those things are important, but also having these conversations about reimagining religious freedom. As I outlined in the segment that I shared, and that there's so many issues that are connected. As Dr. Smallwood said, that they shut down the school district, right? And so what people need to recognize is that when I mentioned about private school vouchers, right, it's not that we're just picking on private schools, right, but also private religious schools as well. One of the things that people need to know is that those voucher programs were created to defy desegregation orders. So people didn't want their white children going to school with Black children. So when people are thinking in current context, what you hear is the language of school choice, right? We heard it in this most recent election in Virginia that the newly elected governor talked about, we're going to prioritize school choice in Virginia. Well, what happens with school choice is money that should be designated for public schools gets designated to other spaces. And then what happens is our children, and we saw this in COVID, then do not have adequate access to get on internet, to take their classes, to have adequate books, or even the facilities that don't serve them well. Because I know even in the school district that I have a school-age child, even in the school district that we're in, they still were not fully equipped for the children to come back to school in some ways when you're taking into account social distancing. So there's so many issues that you can prioritize. So I say, think about what's happening in your community, pay attention. The next steps that you could do to take action is join us on Saturday. Join us Friday first, because you got to learn what's happening on the ground and hear from the experts that are doing some work. But then join us on Saturday for the advocacy training, because then you'll be equipped with the tools and the resources to address any issue that concerns your community. And for you to not just address it, but how do you even contact your elected officials? How do you make an appointment to talk to those that are governing in your state and in your local districts? Those are things that we need to know. And sometimes those are things that are not taught in seminaries, right? And so it's important for us to create spaces like the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative at Vanderbilt Divinity School has done, to create spaces where people can have what I call authentic conversations, courageous conversations, brave conversations, honest conversations about what's really happening. And so that's also what's happening here at this conference. We're going to have those courageous and brave conversations unapologetically, because again, we have to awaken to a new reality about religious freedom, because our lives depend on it. So
Can I weigh in on that?
oh, absolutely, Dr. Teresa.
I will give you my top 5, and they are very similar, but I'm going to state them a little bit differently. My number 1 right now, because there is such a drive towards shaping the public sphere around education, that we need to re-up with what our ancestors were facing back then. They knew that in order for their children to be educated, they had to have their own schools. And this is just the reality that we're in. We need to put our money where our mouth is. And I want you, if you graduated from an HBCU, make a commitment. Let that be your New Year's resolution, that you will give to those institutions that gave to you. So number 1, give to HBCUs. Number 2, organize your neighborhood. Do you even know your neighbors? Organize your neighborhood and help the neighbors understand what's at stake here. You may say, well, what does continuing education and the freedom for teachers to have creativity mean in the context of religious freedom? Well, if you're a Christian like I am, then I know you've read 2 Timothy 2:15. Study to show yourself approved unto God. We have to have study. And then my thing is, if you got an opinion, write your opinion. Do some opinion editorials. Stir up the gifts in your community. Let them know what's at stake. My next one is watch your elected officials. The problem is we've allowed people to be elected and not be accountable. Hold them accountable. Go down there and see what's happening in the council meeting. Attend some of those the judges are always being elected with folk not even knowing who they are. Find out what they're doing, how they're sending people to jail. And then my final, vote like your life depends on it, because it does.
Absolutely, Dr. Teresa. Yes, our lives depend on it. And I would even add to that, voting, but also get involved with volunteering around election time, not just the presidential election, but other elections. I know one of the commitments I made with this past Virginia election is I decided to sign up as a text bank voter volunteer. And so I spent the evening like texting people, encouraging them to vote. And it's so important, because when people, unfortunately, when people see that their concerns are not prioritized because we haven't been as deeply engaged, then people are discouraged from voting. But every vote matters. Every vote matters. We saw that in the elections that took place here in Virginia for the governor, as well as the one that took place in New Jersey. It was a very narrow margin in New Jersey that they were able to win that state over for those that voted a certain way. But it's important for us to like take action and do the work. But also I want to add, Dr. Smallwood, and just push back a little. It's important also for those of us that graduated from HBCUs to hold our HBCUs accountable to the communities in which they say they serve. And so when we present opportunities to engage in conversations that are very difficult, that are not just theological, right? But those that impact us in the public square, we have a responsibility to say, these are the facts, this is what we see. And one of the things that I learned in this past year of the work that I've done in the advocacy field is that I learned from many of my colleagues and coalition partners that elected officials want to hear from faith communities, right? So when faith communities are silent on issues, then those that have narrow ways of navigating the world and understanding freedom for all, I tried to package that very nicely. Have a narrow view of understanding the world comprehensively, when they're the ones that are contacting their elected officials, then they believe that that's what the majority wants. So those of us that are people of faith that have different convictions about human dignity, about social justice, human concerns, need to contact our elected officials just as much. And again, that's why we're having that advocacy session on Saturday with our colleagues at the BJC. I think I saw one other question that was in the chat there, and I'm trying to scroll back up there to see. Oh, okay, so we have a question where someone asked, why do you think this topic is such an uphill battle, given the access to truth and vetted information? Dr. Swabma, you want to respond to that first?
Anything involving people who are not a part of the normative gaze is an uphill battle. Anytime you have to first come into this place fighting to become a citizen, it's uphill. But what I really want to focus in on is the fact that, you know, Frederick Douglass gave us something really important when he says, if you don't have a struggle, you're not even going after something. My thing is, while it is an uphill battle, it is not too complicated. In fact, people are much more capable of dealing with complex things than they used to be. Now, I recognize that America has a great number of people who are a little bit on the imbecile side. But for the most part, people understand the complexities with which we are working and dealing right now. And I want us to engage ourselves in a way that appreciates that when you put it out there, people can absorb it.
I agree. When we put it out there, people can absorb it. That's why we have to engage in this truth telling, right? We have to tell the truth. So people will have a different narrative and a different perspective to lean into. And we have to tell our stories. We have to be in conversation with one another. And one of the things that I'm looking at right now, I see in the chat where Dr. Barbara Julian said, Dr. Dent, we don't need adequate healthcare. We need quality healthcare. And I agree with you. I agree with you, Dr. Barbara. We need quality healthcare, but people need to have the adequate and resources and the adequate spaces that allow them to get the quality healthcare that they need. And so they need to be able to flourish in community in many different ways. And there are many different stories. A couple of weeks ago, Faith for Democracy hosted a Faithful Democracy and Faith in Action actually hosted a 12-hour prayer vigil and rally around the Build Better America plan. And so, which prioritized many different issues that we're talking about tonight, including healthcare. And so we heard so many stories about people who couldn't afford healthcare and had serious health complications and procedures that needed to be done. And so there's a lot of work that needs to happen in that sphere. And that's why we have Dr. Takesha Everett that will be joining us tomorrow as a health expert. And we'll also hear from Reverend Dr. Carrie Jackson, who is with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. That will be one of our presenters on the panel. And so we invite all of you to join us tomorrow at 10 a.m. We'll start at 10 a.m. for with our session with the conversation, Reframing Religious Freedom, Confronting Christian Nationalism. This is a very important conversation that we need to hear, and you'll hear from some of the scholars and contributors of the book, African Americans and Religious Freedom, New Perspectives for Congregations and Communities. So with that, you'll hear from Rama Abdul-Aleen, who is the Executive Director at KARAMAH, Muslim Women Lawyers for Human Rights. You'll also hear from Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, who is the president of the Center for Faith, Justice, and Reconciliation, as well as the Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities at Wake Forest University. We'll additionally be joined by Reverend Charles Watson Jr., who is the Director of Education at the BJC, and along with, and I will host the conversation as your moderator. I want to just share with you ahead of time this evening, and I'm so grateful that all of you have joined us, that unfortunately Dr. Smallwood may not be joining us tomorrow for tomorrow's conversation because she's had an unfortunate death in her family. And so we're holding her in our thoughts and higher consciousness as she not only travels out of state, but she also has to eulogize her cousin. And so Dr. Smallwood, our thoughts are with you. And we appreciate that in the midst of your family's pain, that you are with us this evening and that you have led us into a wonderful way of kicking off this Reimagining Religious Freedom conference. And I'm so grateful to you and Dr. Towns and the Vanderbilt Divinity community and the Public Theology and Racial Justice Collaborative for making this event possible. And so I just want to say and acknowledge that I thank all of you for being with us this evening. We look forward to, and I see there is one additional question that has popped up. And so Dr. Smallwood, if you want to respond to that question, I see that the question is, why is religious freedom used as a weapon against religious minorities and people of color?
It's such a really thoughtful question. Someone who is thinking deeply about this work. What we need to understand is that religious freedom perhaps has been misappropriated. When we started out, with that conversation between Abraham Lincoln and the Danbury Baptists, there was no real question about people being able to be within their religious context. It was a question about whether or not the government was going to try and manage that. And so that was the religious freedom that we understood. But once we got the Second Amendment, well, really the First Amendment in place, the notions of people being able to be in a pluralistic society began to grow. And at present, what we know is that my own ancestors had no real freedom. They, Christianity in the white man's religion was stuffed down their throats. But what people need to be freed to know is that Christianity for Black folks didn't start in North America. We had knowledges about Christianity that was much more freeing and liberative out of Africa. The ancient Kemites understood very clearly. And so what religious freedom has been is a weapon to control people. Religion in general has been that, right? And because we know that, we have to break people away from those old frames that make us feel like if we've got a flag hanging in our church, that somehow we can't speak of certain things. We can't do certain things. And we've allowed the myth of the separation of church and state to somehow cause us to act as though we have nothing to say in the public sphere. And that needs to change. It does not mean that we are becoming a theocracy, however. It simply means that we have a voice and that our faith informs that voice. And if your faith informs that voice the way my faith does, then we will all be seeking a common public life that gives people the benefit of the doubt that, number one, they are human. Number two, they deserve to have the opportunity to pursue life and to pursue it with happiness, that they deserve the opportunity to have just clean drinking water and a roof over their heads and clothes on their backs and enough food in their pantries to live and to thrive and to flourish. And I think that because religion has been deployed as a weapon, what we're seeing now is religion dialing back civil rights. So it was religion that stood in the way of people being able to marry whoever it is they love. Well, didn't LGBTQ folk have religion? Didn't they have a religious faith that should have been honored? Should the government have ever been involved in a decision like that? We have religious context giving corporations the capacity to deny people contraceptions. That's not right. That is pitting religious beliefs against one another. And that's not what the amendment talks about. In fact, the government shouldn't be involved in that. We have religion being heralded as the reason why we should not teach a history that is truth in our schools, as opposed to religion allowing us to realize the importance of studying the truth so that it can make us free. So I believe that you're right, a person who gave forth the question. I think that is Rama, and I know why she asked the question. But yes, it's been deployed as a weapon. But what we have to understand is that no weapon formed against us shall prosper.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, Dr. Teresa. Thank you. And oh my goodness, I'm so full right now from this discussion. And I know that people have many of the questions, but what I would like to do is just remind you all that, again, to join me, first of all, in thanking Dr. Teresa for being with us this evening. You could give virtual chat, like the virtual applause. That would be wonderful. Dr. Teresa, again, I celebrate you. I celebrate the work that you're doing. And I look forward to continuing our journey together, even as you move on to even more full-time work at United Lutheran Seminary. And so much gratitude to you. In terms of logistics for tomorrow, I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow's conversation will start with our speakers on the context, Reframing Religious Freedom, Confronting Christian Nationalism. And so we'll be joined by our presenters, Rama Abdul-Alim, as I mentioned before, Reverend Charles Watson Jr., Dr. Corey D.B. Walker, and unfortunately, Dr. Teresa will not be with us on the video, but in spirit, and that she has given us so much tonight. And then I will be serving as the moderator for that conversation. And then our day will continue with a musical performance by our friend Rogier, who is a member of Black Non-Believers. Remember, we're talking about religious freedom for all. So Rogier has provided us with a beautiful rendition of some of our favorite songs, one of our favorite songs by Stevie Wonder. And there will be sessions at 1 o'clock and also at 3:15. If you you should have received the emails, and you will continue to receive reminder emails to inform you that the event is starting or the event is approaching. Please use the appropriate link to sign in for those events. And again, we thank you for joining us tonight, and we thank all of our partners that have collaborated with us in this work. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for day 2 of Reimagining Religious Freedom. So with that, I want to say thank you and have a great evening.